those 50 key votes in the Senate might feel about this. Joining me now is a Democratic senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy. Senator, I hope your family back in Connecticut stayed dry during the nor'easter. I appreciate you joining us this morning. What can you tell us about where things stand on all of this deal making this morning? What are you hearing?
Well, at the heart of this is an effort by the president, Democrats in Congress, to try to shift the balance of economic power in this country. During the pandemic, those billionaires you're talking about saw their wealth grow by $1.5 trillion. 700 people in this country are now worth $4.5 trillion. Compare that to the poorest 50% of Americans who are worth less than half that. That can't be sustained in a democracy. And so what we're trying to do is ask the wealthy, the very wealthy, to pay their fair share in order to finance some improvements in regular people's lives. In Connecticut, people are struggling, for instance, with paying for childcare. And so we need to ask those billionaires to help regular, average, middle-class families afford to be able to send their kids to daycare. I think we're very close to a deal. I think this new proposal to ask the 700 billionaires in the country to pay a share of taxes on their wealth increase on an annual basis makes a lot of sense. And I think it'll be supported by the broad extent of the American public. So I think we're close, and I hope that we'll have a deal by the end of the day.
Is this billionaires' income taxes being called the best way to do this in your mind, or the best available way to do this in your mind?
We have to thread a very narrow needle in the Senate. We have 50 Democrats, with the vice president breaking the tie. I think each one of us would probably do this differently. If it were up to me, I'd go back and repeal the Trump tax cuts, where the vast majority of the benefit went to the top income earners. But this is, I think, a very creative way, and I think a very economically sound way to ask the very wealthy to pay more. What happens when you have this many people who are worth billions of dollars is that they report very little in income on an annual basis. So Jeff Bezos, pays very little in taxes compared to his wealth, because he's actually just using his wealth to borrow money to finance his lifestyle. So we're trying to find a way to look at these billionaires who have huge amounts of money in the bank and ask them to pay based on that wealth, not just based on the relatively small amount of money that they report as income on an annual basis.
How badly does this deal need to come together before the president gets on a plane to go to Europe roughly 24 hours from now?
I mean, listen, we should get this right, but there's a reason why we would like to get this deal done before the president leaves. It's not an arbitrary deadline. The president on this trip is going to the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. Part of the Build Back Better agenda is, we hope, the biggest down payment on America's contribution to solving climate change in the history of this country, doing it by creating a lot of jobs in renewable energy. It would be good for the president to have an agreement on the Build Back Better bill, which includes a major contribution to America's commitment on climate change reduction when he goes to Glasgow. So again, it's not essential. There's nothing in law that requires the deal to be done by the end of the day, but America's power at that summit will be enhanced if this deal is done.
Even if the deal does get done in the next 24 hours, in your mind, is he bringing enough to Glasgow on climate change? This has far less in terms of climate change than I know you were hoping for.
It does, but the good news on climate is that there are a lot of levers to press. So some of my colleagues, Senator Manchin in particular, has ruled out, some of the more comprehensive approaches to climate, like incentivizing electricity distributors to bring more renewable energy onto the grid. But I think there can be agreement on tax incentives for consumers and businesses to build renewable energy. There can be consensus around the build out of electric vehicle technology in this country. There can be incentives around modernizing the power grid so that we can bring more offshore wind and solar onto the grid. I think we can send the president to Glasgow with a sizable package on greenhouse gas reductions. It might not be as big as some of us would like, but I would still argue that it will end up being the most significant piece of climate legislation that Congress has ever passed.
We'll see if he is able to bring it with him. If this does get done in the next 24 hours, I think that's very much up in the air as we speak. Very quickly, Enes Kanter, center for the Boston Celtics, has been very direct in his criticism of China for its treatment of the Uyghur minority there, what some have deemed to be a genocide there. Enes Kanter, very direct, very critical of President Xi, and critical of Nike also for continuing to do business with China. What's your view on this and what Enes Kanter is saying?
Well, first of all, I'm a big Boston Celtics fan and an Enes Kanter fan, and I think the NBA should reward its players for telling the truth. And I think American corporations should, start getting an ethical backbone when it comes to their dealings with China. It is a genocide, and too many U.S. industries have been bending over backwards to try to paper over what is happening in China. You see Hollywood studio after Hollywood studio refusing to put out movies that are critical in any way, shape, or form of the Chinese government. You now have pressure on the NBA to censor its players when they are simply telling the truth about what's happening in a foreign country. Obviously, this matters deeply to Enes because he is being persecuted right now by the Turkish government. If he went back to his home country, he would be arrested, largely simply for his political views. So, while I understand not every American company is going to unwind their business in China immediately, at the very least, they shouldn't be engaged in self-censorship about the truth with respect to the brutal treatment of the Muslim Uyghur minority inside China. We should be able to allow corporations and the people that work for those corporations to stand up and tell the truth.
Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, go Celtics. I appreciate you being with us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks.